this is where we insert music and we do a little fake ad read for some product that doesn't exist.
That we should totally do, by the way.
We
Until we
should.
get real commercials, we just do our own kind of reading of like, you know.
Snowflake, have you heard about this new thing?
Yeah. We get you there on You Land Air.
Oh, God.
You land here, you land there.
Terrible. Oh, my God. We're going to put that in a fake ad break. Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the Zoom from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew.
Amazing.
We're also here to get deeper on the human elements. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to do that.
But you can think of three. On this week's show, we'll be taking a look at the Apple Podcast app and why people seem to hate it every time it gets an update. Apple, please don't punish our ranking because we chose to talk about this.
Do you think this relates to the ribbon being removed from Excel too? Like, how did Microsoft miss that? How did they... You're familiar with that, right? When Microsoft changed the ribbon in Excel?
I mean, I know when they added the ribbon in Excel. Are you saying did they undo that at some point? I mean, I know like the ribbon has been shrunk in a bunch of apps like Outlook where it never quite made sense. I don't know if I've noticed it go away on Excel. Like I remember the day Sergey was forced to use the ribbon and he lost his phone.
I think that's what it was like, it was the financial community went crazy when they introduced the ribbon then?
It was when they introduced the ribbon because all the shortcuts changed and all the menu locations changed. It would be one thing if they hadn't changed the keyboard shortcuts too, but they also changed keyboard shortcuts to match the new ribbon commands.
I just wanted to get the dates for that. Do you remember?
That would have been in 2007.
How the fuck do you know that? Seriously, how the fuck do you know that?
Because it happened while we were at... We had the MSDN license, and we were using we were using Outlook or Office off of MSDN, which you're not supposed to do.
All right.
Because there was a guy, what was his name? There was a product manager at Microsoft who published blog posts as they did the user research for the ribbon. And I followed those blog posts because I thought it was a super interesting idea. And he explained all of the reasons why they did that. They just forgot to include a fairly important persona. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Market Analysis, where we'll look at a product or app or technology and talk through our impressions, how we think some of the product and engineering decisions were made to arrive at how the thing works, and share our thoughts on how good or bad we think it is. So today's topic is the Apple Podcast app. I am bringing this up as, a brand new podcast trying to rise up the ranks. And so if some person at Apple hears our complaints about this, I'm probably putting us at jeopardy for bringing this up as a topic. But I think it's interesting. I've never heard a good thing about the Apple Podcast app. Every time it makes an update, someone is complaining about a thing that they undid or broke or changed. Like you can literally go find articles today. There's a couple of months ago, they made a podcast app update that everyone hated. 2021, they did it. You can go all the way back to 2017 and people complaining about the updates to the app. So I was, again, my product manager hat on trying to understand how these decisions get made. Reading through an article, like there's a Fast Company article, we'll link it in the show notes. I think it's an interesting look at these advanced users who listen to a ton of podcasts. And I'm not sure if that's the norm. I'm not sure if that's the average Apple Podcast user. And so he's complaining about, he used to be able to listen to a single episode. He didn't have to subscribe to the podcast and it could remember that he was listening to it. He could have a bunch of episodes saved even without subscribing. And basically all of the changes broke how he listened to, at like double speed, hundreds of podcasts in a week. And I can't imagine that's actually the average podcast user. And so I'm thinking, if I'm the product manager for Apple Podcast app, how do I balance? Do I want to get more users of my app who are casual or not podcast listeners at all? And I want to get them in. Do I need to do things? This is kind of like what we were talking about with Twitter. If I want to get the casual casual person to engage with my app, the changes I make possibly break this advanced power user. But the power user is the one using the app 8 hours a day. Don't I want to keep that person satisfied too? So I'm sort of curious, just one, let's talk about what are your podcast consumption like, and what type of user would you get qualified as?
Yeah, and just to counter the overly sensitive Apple product manager here, I have to say Apple Podcast is one of my favorite applications.
Is that true? Or are you saying that just to make sure we don't get punished in the ratings?
There's an element of truth to everything. It's not binary, right? There's a degree of truth to that. And yeah, it has become one of my.
Aren't you an Android user?
Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah,
do,
okay.
do we want to be in the Apple Store or not?
Nope, you're definitely an iOS iPhone lover.
Yeah. Yeah, so it is an interesting conversation, and maybe I fall in the less than power user category, where then there's different buckets of these power users, right? There's the power user that professionally has built their processes around their love and the familiar nature of the application they're using. There's the power user that just consumes a lot and they've been doing it for free for years, and so I'm less concerned, or I'm not as sensitive to their plight. You as a product leader, probably much more so. You say, well, that they are for whatever reason, they're the future, right? They're the ones who are they're the people we're advertising to, and that's where we're going to grow. I'm a little bit in the other camp with the everyday Joes who maybe I use a product like that every couple of weeks or a couple of months. And yeah, maybe I'm telling those people to suck it up a little bit. But it is an interesting conversation we should jump into, because how those decisions are made, I can relate back to when I see a bad TV commercial and I wonder, when they were sitting in the meeting room talking about this, pitching this commercial, who was allowed to speak? Who approved it? How did they miss the mark, right? And let this thing out into the world? And I think, to me, these are similar topics. So I'm looking forward to getting into it.
That's sort of, to me, the first fundamental question as a product manager is, what are your pressure points to making these decisions? Are you trying to find, user growth because you have some Wall Street investment bank owning your company and demanding infinite growth for the next 100 years, which is impossible, but you're going to get fired if you don't deliver 1 million new users next year? And so that is your priority. You're just trying to find what are the things to reduce barriers to getting new people engaged in a thing that they're not used to doing. And podcasts is one of those. Twitter was one of those. And so that becomes your driving factor. You put all other things aside and you start looking at workflows and user experience and saying, okay, well, this is a reason why people don't listen to podcasts. This is a reason why our stats show that they only listen to one podcast a week. These are the things we need to do to get engagement higher. You as a product person are looking at all of the things that are the driving factors. And I don't know why people don't take the time to say, but what happens once I get them hooked into the app? And maybe they do. And again, I feel like this entire podcast of ours is going to be me asking for these product managers to come and like send me an email, agree to come on the show. I just want to understand the thought process of how you got here, because I have to wonder that isn't there some balancing act you could have done to say, okay, we're going to recognize as you're an existing user, when we upgrade to the new version, existing users stay with this current workflow. But if you're a new user who's never opened the app before, we're going to drop you into the new simplified workflow. Couldn't we find ways? It's more engineering, it's more money to the company, therefore, and maybe you're being pressured to save money and go and deliver more users. I don't know. I wonder how you make that choice to not have the next step in the user persona's evolution. Great, you're a casual user, you've done all of this work to get them in there, listening to more podcasts, doing more things. Don't you think they turn into an advanced user at some point? Don't you think some percentage of your users, maybe they don't become the guy listening to 100 podcasts, maybe that guy can go pound sand, but at some point you have to balance for the entire life cycle of the persona, not just the initial phase. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure we both worked at companies that were maybe slightly behind the market on product. So without knowing the inner conversations happening at Apple, are they filling a gap and growing sensibly, slightly behind the market, knowing they are, but also doing the right things to see what are the most important features, what are the things that people will interact with, right? Where is this going? So it's a little difficult without knowing the inner company workings and the roadmap of products like this. But I actually like that in a sense. Like, are they growing? Is this truly, going back to the agile conversation, is this truly how agile should work? Which is, well, it's very lean, right? It's lean, but it's going to grow. And actually what we thought was our power user in the first 2 years there was never any revenue with those guys. There was a stickiness, but it was always going to be capped out at 1 to 2% of the users. And actually, really, our power and our growth was this new power user that we're going after in 2 years' time. So I wonder, in a way, like, do we have to give them some time to see where it leads and to see what service they bring in next? It is, it's kind of like Google, right? Like, a lot of their services connect. So I don't know. I tend to favor the big company here. They won't always get it right, but I like the deliberate growth of their roadmap. And so I am in a way a little bit less sensitive to those current power users.
I guess, but 2017 to 2023, that's 6 years of a roadmap not growing very effectively. That's a long time, even for a big company. So I don't know that I'm going to give them that much of a pass. I do think that's an interesting point, though. Your incentives as a product person are probably different when you're working on an app that comes bundled for free in the OS. And you have, what is your user growth metric? You're not signing up new. Are you a key pillar of why iOS 22 is going to do better than the last version and that sells more iPhones and gets more users into your ecosystem? Are you a key feature? Are you something else? Like, I'm super curious to understand what are the Apple incentives for the podcast app and how they then are making these decisions to get to that point.
What advantage do they have in the future to surpass their competition, right? Because they are embedded in this really rich ecosystem that's continually pulling massive amounts of data about their listeners, service users. Are they gonna have the advantage when we start to see more generative AI? They already have that data, right? And companies who've maybe specialized in software, specifically around the podcast, are they going to be less agile? Is it going to be tougher for them to adapt and say, just admit we don't have as much data as these rich ecosystems like Apple and Google and Facebook? So I wonder, and that's a little bit of an evolutionary question, right? Is for 1,000 years or a couple of million years, certain species can thrive in the environment, then all of a sudden there's an environmental shift, and hey, guess what? Humans, you're all going to die, but the alligators are going to be okay, So as time changes with the new push into AI and machine learning, are they going to start to catch up and surpass? Does their roadmap become richer because of the data? I'm kind of curious as to where they'll be in the next 5 to 10 years versus the last 7, because I could see that they were in a holding pattern. I'm not sure how much of a lucrative market it is, but I think it could become interesting in the next decade.
Well, I think back to, I'd have to go and find if it's a tweet or an article. I saw it in a tweet, and I'll link it in the show notes if I can find it, but it was talking about enshittification, which was the word that they came up with to describe what happens when a company sort of locks up the market and they do everything that they can to become the monopolistic leader of the market, and then they either get acquired or the goal originally was to simply lock people in, and now they don't have to care about the product anymore. I don't remember what the exact example was, but this is also Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer locked everyone into IE6, and then they stopped caring, and it became the worst browser on the internet, but you didn't have a choice. Every company was now using it for all of their intranets. Consumers were on it. And so I wonder, the podcast app is a spin-off of iTunes, and iTunes is what everyone used for a decade, and they had full market control. Is the podcast app just the enshittification of iTunes and a piece of iTunes, and now they have no incentive to make it better? They do little tweaks because they have a thing that they want to do, and maybe there's no reason. The only thing I can't understand is the goal of that usually is to extract as much money as possible from consumers before you just kill the company or the product. I don't know that that happens for podcasts. I don't know that that's a thing that you can do for Apple. So I'm not saying Apple's doing enshittification of the podcast app, but it's a weird pattern that I cannot understand the goals of. And I think that's the thing. If I understood your goals, maybe I could understand where you're going, but it's perplexing to me why every time this app gets updated, everyone seems to hate it. And I can't tell if it's because the loudest people are the power users, and maybe the average consumer just doesn't notice it. But I feel like there's Reddit threads talking about how terrible this app is every single time. I don't know. I'm just I have so many questions. I just want to understand. And it feels like a thing that other apps tend to run into. So Twitter runs into this, where power users lose features and capabilities that they were taking advantage of to manage their Twitter experience. Yes, they were probably 5% of all of the Twitter users, but you were catering to somehow grow the 95% at the expense of the 5%. And as a product person, I constantly want to figure out, is there a way I can do both? can I keep the power user happy while also figuring out ways to make the casual users more engaged?
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? Because it's separating out the noise from the real data, the metrics, right? So the people who are unhappiest are going to scream the loudest, and they're the ones you're gonna read on the threads and the boards. But then the quietly happy people just go about using the software
Right.
and adapt and embrace, right? I do know they have a considerable market share in the podcast space, though, right? I think only Spotify has a larger user base, which is for something that's secondary to your business. Is that so terrible to be in that space and have that position?
Right. And then why would yeah, if you're that big, it's either because you're just resting on your laurels and no one's in charge over there and some terrible decisions are getting made, or there's reasons that these things are happening, which is user growth and something else. And I need to understand. Someone needs to walk me through the roadmap of the last 5 years of the podcast app and help me understand how we got here.
Yeah, I had a terrible analogy, which is like, well, if I'm the mechanic and I've got all the mechanic business, but I'm also like the second place people come for their donuts, it's not a bad place to be, right?
Sure. And maybe if my mechanics take a little bit longer than they need to, then they'll have to eat a second donut.
The donuts are a day old, but the convenience, it's like it's
Right.
the same. It's like Home Depot having a diner, right? Like it's not going to be the greatest food, but it's great to have a Sunday breakfast before I go home and start working on the house. So
People seem to love those IKEA Swedish meatballs,
they do.
which I don't understand. Those are gross.
Starbucks and Target, right? Like now I can get my coffee.
Sure.
What do you hate about it so much?
I don't hate anything. I'm just constantly hearing about how people hate it. I'm an Android user too. So, like, I just want to understand. Right. Yeah. I ditched the iPhone years ago. So I want to understand I am just the person who watched all the DVD extras because I had to understand how you made this cool thing. And I am constantly looking at the world through the lens of my own job and just constantly wondering, how did you get to the decision to have everyone on the internet constantly complain every time you update your app? It's baffling to me. And there might be perfectly valid decisions. It might be an 80-20 rule where the 20% are the loudest and the 80% are perfectly happy. And there's no incentive for Apple to do anything else. And that might be perfectly valid. But it confuses me as a person who tends to fall into the power user category, that there's not, like, I don't need to be everyone's favorite special little snowflake who gets special treatment. But I am the person generating a ton of content on Twitter. I am the person listening to a bunch of podcasts. I would think you would want me to not hate using your experience. So I'm just super curious about the decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I do love that with two Android users beating on an Apple
Complaining about the
product, right?
podcast app. I know,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting. I think there's a couple of thoughts. I think it's less likely maybe I give Apple more respect than they deserve on this, but I assume it's not dysfunction and hey, there's bad decisions, right? I like to think that Apple still has pretty good standards enough that they're not releasing without some thought process and analytics behind their decisions.
I grew up in Issaquah, a suburb of Seattle, which was next door to Redmond in the 90s. So I've seen Microsoft's monopolistic behavior up front and personal. No massive company gets default respect from me. I assume everything is Internet Explorer 6 and that there's just terrible decisions being made because you have monopoly power and you don't have any incentive to do good things. But that's
Yep.
just me.
And that's fine, right? So let's run with that for a second, and let's pretend they are just making. Let's pretend it's the same as the TV commercial, where it's a bunch of guys sitting in a room, and the loudest voice, which happens to be one of the worst one of the worst design decision voices, is winning. I would still argue then, one, it must be a pretty decent product. The fact that it's embedded probably helps, but it must be pretty decent if they still have such a considerable market share. And then two, maybe they can afford to have some of those. But if you look at Microsoft Excel with the introduction of the ribbon and a whole industry of financial service guys were completely rocked. Literally, they released it and people on the day, having the ribbon, we're like, this broke everything. Like
Right.
we're losing money now. And then it took a couple of small iterations to fix that. Like, hey, classic view, here we go, classic view. So maybe that is a mentality that we'll see more of from a product like from the podcast app, where it's like people hated this, stick in a feature flag, you know. But yeah, it is interesting. There's other examples I'm sure we could find. But yeah, I don't know why I'm defending Apple right now. Why am I defending them?
Because we got to make sure our new podcast gets up the charts.
Well, it is one of my favorite applications after all. I did say. Well, yeah, it's no complaints from me, Apple.
All right. I do think that this is a pattern we're going to run into with other apps as we talk about stuff like this in the future. And I am hopeful that in other cases, we can maybe try to divine the intentions behind making that trade-off for power users and sort of casual users. So I'm looking forward to those future discussions. All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you like what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember that the name of the podcast is My Brother, and Me. Also, tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there go by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. And a friendly reminder that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app just updated everything and now it's terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. Just send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking a coworker or something. Follow us on Twitter and Blue Sky. We're at AcceptancePod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog onto that account. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at KThomasEuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.